Here now the readings today. First, from the Gospel according to Mark. Hear this word. You'll notice today that I've chosen to read to you out of a contemporary paraphrase. It's really not a translation at all. The Message is a paraphrase, and in many ways a helpful one. And you'll also know if you come here regularly, I almost never read the Message in this context. I read it often for my own study, but I like the more formal New Revised Standard Version much better in general terms. But once in a while, I tell you what's behind it is sometimes stories are so familiar to us that once you hear the opening line or two, our minds naturally say, "Oh yeah, I know this story," and it's easy to kind of miss the power of them, and sometimes to hear them in a different idiom just sort of wakes us up again to the power of the stories that we know well. So here it is, the feeding of the 5,000, a story well known to most of us here. The apostles then rendezvoused with Jesus and reported on all they had done and taught. Jesus said, "Come off by yourselves, let's take a break and get a little rest." For there was constant coming and going. They didn't even have time to eat. So they got in the boat and went off to a remote place by themselves. Someone saw them going, and the word got around. From the surrounding towns then, people went out on foot running and got there ahead of them. When Jesus arrived, he saw this huge crowd. At the sight of them, his heart broke. They were like sheep with no shepherd. He went right to work, teaching them. When his disciples thought this had gone on long enough, it was now quite late in the day, they interrupted. "We are a long way out in the country, and it's very late. Pronounce a benediction and send these folks off so they can get some supper." Jesus said, "You do it. Fix supper for them." They replied, "Are you serious? You want us to go spend a fortune on food for their supper?" But he was quite serious. "How many loaves of bread do you have? Take an inventory." That didn't take long. 5, they said, plus 2 fish. Jesus got them all to sit down in groups of 50 or 100. They looked like a patchwork quilt of wildflowers spread out on the green grass. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, lifted his face to heaven in prayer, blessed, broke, and gave the bread to the disciples, and the disciples in turn gave it to the people. He did the same with the fish. They all ate their fill. The disciples gathered 12 baskets of leftovers. More than 5,000 were at that supper. And then, turning over to the book of Romans, hear this word as Paul writes to the early congregation. "Love from the center of who you are. Don't fake it. Run for dear life from evil. Hold on for dear life to good. Be good friends who love deeply. Practice playing second fiddle. Don't burn out. Keep yourselves fueled and aflame. Be alert servants of the Master, cheerfully expectant. Don't quit in hard times. Pray all the harder. Help needy Christians. Be inventive in hospitality. Bless your enemies. No cursing under your breath. Laugh with your happy friends when they're happy. Share tears when they're down. Get along with each other. Don't be stuck up. Make friends with nobodies. Don't be the great somebody. Don't hit back. Discover beauty in everyone. If you've got it in you, get along with everybody. Don't insist on getting even. That's not for you to do. I'll do the judging, says God. I'll take care of it. Our scriptures tell us that if you see your enemy hungry, go buy that person lunch, or if he's thirsty, get him a drink. Your generosity will surprise him with goodness. Don't let evil get the best of you. Instead, get the best of evil by doing good. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God shall stand forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Grant, O Lord, that we might be the masters of ourselves to become the servants of others. Take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire for Thee. Amen. Well, right before the service started, James Ingold, who's one of our local accountants, said he was so thrilled to see I had a percentage in the sermon title this week, which is not often that I do. You'll know that. But that title today, 80% of life is just showing up. You may know that is a quote from Woody Allen, the filmmaker. And the story behind it is that Woody Allen said that once to an aspiring writer friend of his, a man who was a good writer and had written a book, a novel, that Allen had read and thought was great, but the man was resisting sending it off to an editor for review and for consideration of being published. Sensing his friend's reluctance at having somebody look with a critical eye at his great novel, Allen said, famously, "You know, the only way to do something is to just go ahead and do it. No one I know has ever done anything good without just putting themselves out there and then seeing what happens. 80% of life consists in just showing up. That is the single biggest life lesson I know that has worked. All others have failed me." Now, I am not a great fan of everything Woody Allen says or does, but I think this idea of life in large part consisting in just showing up, not holding back, offering up what you've got to life and to God, and then trusting that something will come of that. I think that is a noble idea and an important idea, and I happen to think that it is really an idea that is at the very heart of the story of the feeding of the 5,000. The feeding of the 5,000, you may know, is unique in the Gospels, or at least in very limited company in the Gospels, because it is one of the very few stories that occurs in all four Gospel stories. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell this story, and scholars will tell you that when a story appears in all four of the Gospels, you can be sure that it means it's an important story. And it was very important for the early Christian community to hear that story. They made sure that it was as widely told and distributed as possible. And this story, Jesus and his disciples finding themselves up against what seems to be an seemingly overwhelming need, and then somehow, with the disciples' meager resources being a key, God blessing it and there being enough to go around, that apparently was a theme that was really important to our ancestors. It resonated in a big way with the life experience of the first century church, who presumably found themselves all the time facing big needs and feeling, that in comparison they were just, about that big, just a drop in the bucket. You remember the context of this story. The crowd, according to all four Gospels, really, the crowd is kind of worked up at this point in Jesus' ministry. They've been following him around. There's kind of a high emotion running with this entourage that has been in Jesus' wake as he's made his way through Galilee. News of his healings have gone around, and the crowd, the story says, is now sort of pressing in upon him. They've identified him as kind of a religious celebrity, and the gospel writers say they press in because they want to see a miracle. But the story says that Jesus was not really, at that point, eager to supply that. It says, in fact, he was tired and wanted some time to rest and reflect, and so he withdraws with the disciple across the Sea of Galilee. They get into a boat and they start making their way to the other side of the Sea of Galilee for a little time of reflection and renewal. If you've ever been there, you can see from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other quite readily. And so what happens is the crowd watches them go, and as soon as they can kind of figure out from the trajectory of the boat where he's going to dock, they just start off like a mob and they run around the lake. It's about a 9-mile trek to get around the edge of the Sea of Galilee to make their way to the other side. And so, just when Jesus wants to have a little renewal time, pray and get rejuvenated in the face of all these demands, here he is now in the presence of this crowd once again. Only now they're not only spiritually needy, but they're physically needy. They've gone the 9-mile hike, they're tired, they're footsore presumably, and the night is falling and they're hungry. And the story says, as you remember, Jesus instantly recognizes the need which is in front of them, and that's not surprising at all. He was adept at noticing needs everywhere he went, of course, but what is surprising, at least it was surprising to the disciples, was that he immediately turned to them and called upon them to come up with an answer. John says in his account that he looked at the 12 and asked, "Where are we to buy bread to feed these people?" And Mark, in his version, records that Jesus just told them, "Take an inventory and do something. You feed them." And interestingly enough, I like Philip's reaction to all of this. Philip tends to be one of the more practical disciples, and the story says he looks out at the crowd and sees the size of that. He looks into the little treasury of the disciples and sees how small that is, and he comes back, kind of with the purchasing agent approach and says, really, well, here's the bad news, Master. 6 months' pay would not be enough to give them all even a crumb apiece. And at that point, the choice is staring the disciples in the face. Either show up and give what you have and do what you can, or say it can't be done. And by the grace of God, they follow their instructions, and they choose the healthier option. They take inventory, they all pony up what little bit they have, and they report, well, here it is, Jesus, such as it is. 5 loaves, and we also have these 2 fish. And that, the story says, is the trigger for the miracle of grace. It's a miracle, but it's not a flashy miracle, is it? It's not a magical kind of miracle. I think of it as kind of an earthy miracle. All we know for sure is that it was brought when Jesus asked for it, and that was, despite its limitations, it was enough. Despite it being a drop in the bucket, with God it was much more than that. When they didn't hold back, when they let go of what they had, it was enough. And that's because of who God is. God is the one who takes the little and makes it a lot. There's a name for that. It comes from the language of physics. Synergy is the word. You hear people, I like to watch those TED Talks. Do you ever watch those? And in TED Talks, they talk about synergy a lot. But synergy actually is a word with its roots in theology. It means literally working together, synergy. 2 things, 2 entities coming together to be more than the sum of their parts. And synergy, I think, is at the heart of this loaves and fishes story. God and ordinary people with limited resources working together. It becomes this force to be reckoned with, because apparently the disciples are taking to heart this idea that they can be something they would never be when they stay connected to Jesus Christ. St. Augustine in the 3rd century talked about theological synergy, I think, in a very helpful way, and very succinctly. He said it this way: "Without God, we cannot, but without us, God will not." That is to say, there needs to be a partnership in making the grace and the love and care of the divine a reality in the everyday world. And in every generation, I think, whether or not we will believe that, whether we have confidence to trust that God can take our little bit and do something significant with it, that is a key defining question for Christians in every generation, and for us every day we live. Will we allow God to take our small bit and see what comes of it? I've been rereading this summer parts of a classic book of the church by a theologian named Jürgen Moltmann. Jürgen Moltmann, along with his wife Elizabeth Wendell, who is a good theologian in her own right, wrote a book published some time ago called Passion for God, which really is a collection of essays that this theologian Jürgen Moltmann gave at Vanderbilt a few years back when he was approaching about 80 at that time. He's almost 90 now. And Jürgen Moltmann is a famous theologian, as theologians go. He's written extensively on hope in the Christian life. I think any seminary class that focuses at all on the dimensions of hope in human life will have you read Jürgen Moltmann's Theology of Hope. But his life story, to me, is at least as interesting as his books. He is a fascinating person in terms of how he came to understand God and how God became real in his life. And in my way of thinking, Moltmann's story is very much of a loaves and fishes story, a little bit becoming something really significant with the blessing of God. The story of Jürgen Moltmann is this. In July of 1943, Moltmann was conscripted in the German army, World War II. He became a Nazi soldier. And he was assigned to Hamburg. That was his hometown. He was just 17 years old, 1943. War raging in Europe at that point. And his first experience was to be on his post in Hamburg as the Allied bombs rain down on that city. And he watches over the next several weeks as like 40,000 people in Hamburg, including women and children and civilians, were killed by the bombing and the firestorms that would follow them. He then was captured by the Allies, and he was sent to a POW camp in New Hampshire, where he would be held clear to the end of the war, about 3 years. And being in prison left him lots of time to mull over what he had seen in the war in Hamburg. And despite his secular upbringing, he was not a church person at all, neither were his parents, and never really raised any religious issues with him. But he started to have religious questions come up in light of what he had experienced in the war and now his imprisonment in New Hampshire. Questions that just wouldn't leave him alone. Is there a God? And if not, is this horror of war the best we can expect from human beings? And if there is a God, how in the world could God let all this stuff happen? Does God care or know about the Holocaust? Or what does God think of me that I have allied myself with this horror? And what does it mean to say that I have fought on the side of this horrible, oppressive regime? And all of that was churning in him, this great sense of guilt, deep questions about theology. And all this was his fodder for thought day after day when some dedicated Christians in New Hampshire, in the town where the prison was, approached the commander of the POW camp. And these church folks asked if they could, each week, invite one POW to each church family's home for Sunday dinner. They said, it would be their final act of Sunday worship for today. Their way, so to speak, of showing up and offering some tangible seed of compassion and living out Jesus' mandate to love our enemies. They went to the commander and said, we want one prisoner per family of our church, and we'll take them home for dinner, and then we'll bring them back. And the commander reluctantly agreed because he didn't know if, prisoners would run for the hills or what would happen. But Moltmann was among those. At the time he was 19 years old, and he found himself welcomed week after week in the homes of Christians who fed him Sunday dinner, and then they would hold hands with him as they thanked God for the food, and they also would thank God for bringing them a visitor to whom they could show compassion. And he said, it didn't take many weeks of that for me to start to say, any God worthy of the name would be a God whose love is a lot like that I'm experiencing on Sundays at noon. Qualities like acceptance and forgiveness and graciously given dignity that I hadn't earned. That's what God, if there is a God, that's what God would have to be like. And he was given a Bible one Sunday after dinner and said, you could take this back and start to read it. And he started to read, and all of a sudden, he said, the lights came on. I read the story of Jesus, and then I saw what that meant as it was lived out for me on Sunday afternoons. And it was the Bible, but even more than that, it was the chicken on Sunday and the prayer afterward and the being included that pointed to a God that was a particular kind of God that I understood firsthand, a God who had passion for the world and passion for the well-being of others, and who was willing to go to some lengths to show that. And so when he was freed from his POW camp, he enrolled in a theological school, and he became this, religious giant. He earned a doctorate, taught in prestigious seminaries, and he taught out of his experience in the prison camp that, here's what he said, the opposite of Christianity I discovered there in the prison camp is not atheism. The opposite of Christianity is apathy. It would be withdrawing from the world and staying aloof from the pain of others and staying detached and assuming that you have no part to play in making the love of God real to anybody else. That's what I had been tempted to do as a soldier, he said, to only see the power of living for myself. But those New Hampshire families, they refused to say we can't make a difference. They refused to stay disengaged. They said, we'll do this much because it's what's in our power to do. Moltmann said the apathetic person is the antithesis of the faithful person. The person who, the apathetic person no longer participates in life, no longer cares enough to offer anything other than indifference to the challenges they see around them. And in the last book that he wrote, he was almost 90 when he wrote it, he was able to say this. He said, of course now I have answers to what happened to me that I didn't have when I was a 17-year-old. Of course now I believe that God noticed what happened to the city of Hamburg. And of course I now understand that God cared about the 40,000 people who died there and the hundreds of thousands who died in Dresden and London and on the battlefield. And of course, the 6 million killed in the death camps. God suffers every one of those deaths, he went on to say, which is what the cross of Christ is all about. The cross is our statement that God is not an abstract philosophical concept, but a passionate, personal, caring friend who, in the face of needs large and small, wants above all else to convey that in the care of other humans, his care is present and felt. And I have to wonder if he was thinking about his own mortality. He's 90 when he wrote this. He went on to say that in light of the great passion God has for the world, our greatest challenge as people is to stay passionate about it too. I like that. In light of God's passion for us, our challenge as the faithful is to stay passionate about the world, to not hold back, and to care enough to rise to the occasions which summon our help. And this is how he ends his book. What oppresses us in the hour of death is not the life that has been lived and loved, but rather the life that has not been lived and that has neglected its possibilities. Only the passion of love makes the person alive right down to their very fingertips. And I like that very much. And I think it's the live issue for all of us as people of faith, how to live our lives and use the gift of time every day for the grace and the blessing of God. Will I offer my loaves and fish, or will I turn inward and keep my little safe haven and essentially turn my life only in on myself? This much I can tell you. In the gospel story, we are never told exactly how those disciples' meager gifts were multiplied that day. It's interesting that though the story occurs in all four Gospels, not one Gospel writer says anything about the mechanics of that. There's nothing said about Jesus offering any magic words, or there being some moment of transubstantiation or anything like that. The writers are all unanimous in this. There was a big need, there was a little bit given, and it turned out to be more than anybody would have thought. And I notice what the implication is here. The implication is that if the disciples had held back that day, there would have been no miracle. If they had not offered their gifts, there would have been hunger that was not met. If I hold back what little I have when God calls upon me to share the grace and love of God, and you hold back and the whole church holds back, when we are called upon to care for others, the channels of grace are blocked. That's what the story implies. And that's the bad news. But the good news is that the opposite is also true. You know, you give your part, I give my part, and God does the rest. That we show up, and lo and behold, it's far more than anyone would have thought. And so I just want to close today by asking you a question. How many loaves do you have in serving God this week? How many loaves do you have to give, and how many fish? I can tell you this, the number you come up with, either few or many, is not nearly as important as your willingness to show up and present it at the feet of Jesus. Because when that demand comes for you to share, you are God's partner. You are God's partner. He looked to that crowd years ago and said, give me what you have and I'll bless it. And he looks to us today. So may we rise to the occasion and be partners with God in this miraculous synergy of God's abundant grace. Amen.